Thank you all for having me this evening. I'm really glad to be here. I'm Rick Jacobus, and I work with cities all over the country on inclusionary housing and other policies that are really aiming at how do we get more housing built and how do we have more of that housing be affordable. And so we're going to talk about inclusionary zoning tonight. And I just want to start out by saying, inclusionary zoning is a sometimes controversial topic. It's been a great way for cities to produce affordable housing in a very cost-effective way to make a real difference, but it comes with some trade-offs, and it only works when we get those trade-offs right. And so we're going to focus a lot tonight on what are the trade-offs, what are the possibilities, where's the potential, and also what do we have to do to make sure we deliver on that potential and that we don't let the inclusionary become a barrier to housing. And it requires a little bit more attention than a lot of the housing policies, but it's worth the trouble. I just want to start with a really quick reminder of the history, which is even the term inclusionary zoning is really comes from this earlier experience that we had all across the country of exclusionary zoning. And really, zoning itself was used for many, many decades in many places as a tool to prevent economic integration or to racial integration, even more specifically. And so we had zoning that was used to keep people out and to keep communities of in a single economic strata or type of housing. And inclusionary zoning was really one of several policies that arose to try to combat that and reverse that trend and sort of use the same tool, but in the other direction, and to try to create mixed income communities, more economically and even racially integrated communities, and to try to integrate economic diversity across all the different parts of our cities. The way it works, just I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but just to start at the very most basic level, is inclusionary housing or zoning policies require affordable housing when a developer builds new market rate housing. The idea is to include some affordable units in every new market rate project. And the idea there is that the housing then is integrated not just in each building, but in each neighborhood, that automatically we get affordable housing in the neighborhoods that might have been hard to get an affordable housing project built in previously. And if we keep those units affordable over the long term, which is what we tend to do in these programs, we end up with a strategy for building economic integration across neighborhoods. So there's some housing at every affordability level everywhere, instead of the previous pattern where we had concentrations of poverty and concentrations of wealth. And it doesn't eliminate that trend, but it works in the opposite direction. So just to contrast it or sort of put it in context, most of the affordable housing that gets built in your communities and really across the whole country is what we call 100% affordable housing, right? It's the housing that gets government subsidies, where the whole building is all affordable. Maybe there's low-income housing tax credits or state money or city housing trust fund money that goes to bring down the cost. And that housing tends to serve people at very, very low incomes or low, extremely low incomes. So 0 to 60% of area median income. Um, we obviously would like to have more of that housing. Always a wait list and there's a high demand, but there's limited resources. We don't have enough money coming from the federal government in the state to subsidize all of the 100% affordable projects that would be needed to serve the needs in our communities. And sometimes it's hard to get those approved. There's still a lot of places where neighbors are fearful of 100% affordable developments. And I'd say wrongly, like the data is really consistently good that our operators of affordable housing do a good job and these are good neighbors, but still people have a perception and sometimes it's hard to get them into every community. Inclusionary zoning, by contrast, provides that affordable housing and it automatically gets integrated everywhere. And it does it generally without public subsidy, though you'll see in some cases we give tax incentives like MFTE that count as subsidy, but mostly it's the incentives themselves, the density, the other things we'll talk about today that are financing the cost. But we serve people at a slightly higher income level generally. So we set aside 10 to 20% of the housing, sometimes 5, sometimes 25, but generally 10 to 20%. And we serve people between 50 and 80% of median income, sometimes 100, sometimes a little more for home ownership. Um, and so it's a slightly different product. We still call it affordable housing because it's tested. It's you have to qualify and there's support and government oversight. We also have two flavors of inclusionary zoning, mandatory and voluntary, and they sound very different. The mandatory program, you're a developer, you have to build affordable housing, and we're going to give you some incentives, some bonus density, maybe parking waivers or fee reductions, something else, but you have to build it whether you want those incentives or not. In a voluntary program, if you want the incentive, you have to provide the affordable housing. And if you don't provide the affordable housing, you can still build your project. You just can't get the extra density or the waivers or bonuses or whatever else. And while those sound very different, the economics are very similar. We have to get the math right so that the incentives are attractive to a developer in order for them to choose it under the voluntary program. And we have to get the math right so the incentives are appropriate for a developer to be able to move forward and have a viable project under the mandatory program. The evidence so far is that the mandatory programs produce more affordable housing and they also produce more market rate housing. And the reason for that is if everyone has to build the affordable housing, it creates a strong incentive for the developers to also build the extra density that's sort of built into that incentive, if the incentive is density. So if you get to build more units on the site, if you provide affordable housing, when we require it, everybody ends up building the higher density. When we have it optional, sometimes it's just more trouble. The developer doesn't want to learn the system, whatever. They build a smaller project, and we get less affordable housing, but we also get less market rate housing. The difference between these two is mostly what happens when we get it wrong. In a mandatory program, if we get the math wrong, it can become a barrier to development, and so less gets built. In a voluntary program, if we get the math wrong, the developers just choose the lower density project and they don't provide the affordable units. And so we get less housing either way. We get no affordable housing either way if we get it wrong. And in the voluntary program, we get some market rate housing, and in the mandatory program, we could stand in the way. There are about 1,000, more than 1,000 of these programs nationwide. You can see this map. There's a blue dot for every one of the programs that Grounded Solutions identifies. And they're, as you can see, highly concentrated in certain places, and those are the expensive places. And these programs continue to expand as the number of places in America that see themselves as expensive places grows, right? There's just more and more communities where the first thing the voters are raising, as a concern is affordable housing, and those places are turning to inclusionary housing a lot. The first question I want to talk about is who's paying for these inclusionary units? Like I just said, the government isn't generally paying for it. This is great because we're paying for everything else in affordable housing. So it's been popular for that reason, but it's not magically free. And I'm going to walk you through the logic behind this, but what we are seeing in the research is that the incentives are primarily the source of the payment. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. But let me say that the thing you hear a lot, particularly from people who are concerned about these policies, is that somehow the affordable units are being paid for by their neighbors in the other units, on the market rate units in those same buildings, that the developer is going to, in order to make affordable units available, is going to have to raise the rent on the other units in the building. And while that makes a certain kind of sense, it really hold up if you think about it for a minute. And the way I think about it is if the developer could charge a higher rent, then what was keeping them from charging that higher rent before there was inclusionary? And by that, when you think about a new building, the rent gets set by the market, and the developers need to get tenants, and they're very concerned about exactly how does the amenities and the units in their building compete in the existing market, and mostly they're competing with existing buildings. When you impose a requirement like inclusionary, you do create a real cost for developers, but they don't have a way to pass that cost on to the tenants because they're already charging the highest rent they can get away with in the market. And if they were to just raise their rent, they'd have more vacancy, not more revenue. And so we have to think a little harder about who carries this cost because it isn't just that the developers are paying the money out of their pocket. What we think is happening, and the research is pretty consistently pointing to this, is that it's the property owners that are carrying the cost. And the way it works is land doesn't really have its own inherent automatic value. Land is valued based on what you're allowed to do on that land. And so zoning is the way we establish land value essentially. And so you're probably all familiar with the idea that like the denser a site is zoned, the greater the density on a site, the more the land is going to sell for. So this is an example of two similar sized sites, block apart in California, and one of them is zoned in a way that only allowed 15 units per for the site, and the other one is allowed 50 units, and you can see the land value is more than double, right? It's not exactly per unit, but the land is worth more if you can build more housing on it. And when we change the rules in zoning, we every time change the land value that property owners are going to end up being able to negotiate with developers or the price that developers are going to pay. One way to think of it is that the city has like two levers, one that increases property values and one that lowers property values. And so when we have something like an upzoning or a density bonus, or we have a new policy that's going to reduce parking requirements or a fee waiver or any of the other sorts of incentives, and we'll talk about some of them later, any of those things that make it more feasible to build, the builders are all bidding against each other for the same parcels of land, and suddenly they're able to bid more. And because it's a competitive market, the landowners choose the developer that bids the most. And so if you provide extra density, in some sense, all the developers should be making more money, but really they don't make any more money. They have to pass that on to property owners because they bid against each other and they have a standard profit that they need. They're not going to take less than that, but anything above that is like a windfall, and it's the landowners that end up with that windfall. And economists call that residual land value. The idea that the whatever's left over sort of falls down to the land. On the flip side, you have policies that show up as costs. So inclusionary housing, you're requiring expensive, affordable units, and that reduces the profitability of every building that's subject to it. Similarly, when you impose a park fee or an open space fee or anything like that, you're pushing down land values. And what matters is the net of those things. So in this example on the slide, we've got incentives that add $10 million in value to a site, and we have requirements that take $7 million away from the value of the site, and the net is a $3 million increase. So even though you might hear the developer come to the meeting and say, oh, it's this policy is going to cost $7 million, if they're not also valuing the incentives, the answer is, well, no, actually, it's increasing value by $3 million when we put the two together. It's just as possible that your combination of incentives and requirements would go the other way, and that maybe you would have $7 million worth of incentives and $10 million worth of costs. And then what you're doing is you're pushing downward pressure on land prices by $3 million. And you can have any other combination, but it's that the way of thinking about it in terms of the net impact that's critical to the economics of inclusionary. Because we're not just requiring affordable units. So what that means is when we have what we consider an aggressive requirement, and where there's a lot of requirements and very few incentives, there's a risk that we push land prices down so much that property owners don't want to sell their land anymore. And what happens when that happens is we get less building. And so I said before, the developers can't just pass the cost on to the neighbors as higher rent, but it can result in higher rent, not just for the other people in that building, but in the whole of your city, if your requirements are so strong that the property owners won't sell their land and developers can't build. You end up with less supply, and that pushes up the rent for everyone. Now, not as much as if you were to just divide the whole cost across the other buildings, other units in one building. But that's the concern that we're trying to pay attention to, is to make sure that the requirements aren't too much for property owners to absorb. And the way we do that is with incentives. And so we have density and we have zoning variances and fee reductions and fee waivers and permit expediting and streamlined processing, tax incentives like the MFTE, all combine to carry most of the cost of the inclusionary, or sometimes more than most of the cost, so that the policy doesn't wind up being a drain on the development process, doesn't wind up being a barrier. And that's the key question we're going to keep talking about tonight. Next slide. So there've been a set of studies, and one of the things that's really I find frustrating working in this space is that when you see a news article about a piece of research, there's just like it's always one or the other. Either the news story says the study found that inclusionary zoning causes higher rents or it causes lower development, or else it says the study found inclusionary zoning doesn't cause higher rents or doesn't cause less development. And we see both of those studies, and when you read them closely, there's actually almost no disagreement between the academics that are researching these programs. What we see is in some places, inclusionary policies have had a negative impact on the rate of production or have caused slight increases in rent. So the study that's cited here is a study about the Baltimore region, and she found a 1% increase in rent in the jurisdictions that had inclusionary and compared to the other jurisdictions in that area. And then we see other studies like the one on the right where they don't find that, or these actually, the one that's cited there, they studied Boston and they found a slight reduction in the rate of production, like fewer homes were built in the jurisdictions around Boston that had inclusionary by a small amount. But then they studied the San Francisco Bay Area and they found no effect on either rent or production. And the way they explained the difference was the Bay Area programs had incentives that offset the cost of providing the affordable units. They added density, they reduced parking. And the study in Baltimore said the same thing. The jurisdictions that had incentives didn't have these effects, and the jurisdictions that didn't have incentives did. And the effects were still small, but they were offset by the incentives in the places that had them. So what we're seeing is it really isn't a question of inclusionary does this or doesn't. It's a question of how does the inclusionary requirement fit with the package of incentives? Are we imposing a large or a small or a negative cost on development? And it's really the devil's in the details. And just to say, it's not automatically the case that you wouldn't ever want to impose any cost. I mean, we have lots of policies where we require new developments to carry some of the cost of either infrastructure or parks or schools, and we include affordable housing in that list. And the question really is, how strong is your market? What can development afford? What share of the cost of building out space can new development afford? And if you set these various things at different levels, what will the results be in terms of whether things will get built? We try really hard not to create such burdensome requirements or costs that developers can't build. But we have to make policy choices based on the needs of our communities, and affordable housing is just one of several things. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that come up, and one of them is can we build enough? Could we just build instead of requiring affordable housing? Couldn't we just build more market rate housing, and wouldn't that solve the problem? And it would be really great if it would, and it is absolutely true that building more is critical to the problem. Like the problem gets worse the less we build, so we have to build. But sometimes you hear this argument that if all we do is just build more market rate housing, that'll take care of the problem. And we haven't seen that happening in other places. And so the first thing I want to mention is filtering, and it's just this idea that when we build new high-end housing, it's true that the most of the new housing we build is really expensive. And it's also true that the people who move into that move out of slightly less expensive housing, and the people who move into that housing from even less expensive. So the benefit of the new housing kind of trickles down through the economy. And it really is clearly the case. And there's been a set of studies recently that have documented the degree to which it's the case that actually does result in benefit sort of spreading all the way down to even to lower income tenants. And it's definitely the case that the places that are building the most housing have seen the least rent increases. So rent, either building more either brings rents down or it sort of keeps them from rising faster. But what you see is that the 10 largest metro markets that built the most housing between 2020 and 2023 saw a 2.5% reduction in the degree to which rents increased. So their rents went up by 2.5% less than everybody else's. So it is key to keeping rents down. If we don't build enough, rents will go up, and that makes it harder. But the benefit of building more, particularly when we build at the high end of the market, isn't spread out evenly. If we build a new high-end housing project, that makes a big difference in the rents for expensive housing, and it makes a smaller difference in the rents for middle income housing, and an even smaller difference for the rents that low income people pay. And so there's this sort of diminishing returns where we don't see anywhere in the country where we built enough housing that rents have come down to a level that low income people can afford. It makes a difference for middle income people to have lower rents, but we're not replacing the need for housing that's income qualified, income targeted, because we can't build that much housing. And when we do, it's mostly benefiting the higher end of the market. Um, and just to sort of illustrate the like how much we'd have to build. So, remember I said there's a 2.5% decrease in the rent. So these are the blue bars here are the rents in your East Side jurisdictions. And the black line is the 50% AMI affordable rent, and the lower line is the 30% AMI affordable rent. And so to serve people at 30% of AMI, the rents in some of your jurisdictions would have to drop like by 65%, not 2.5%, right? And I just want you to imagine what would happen if you built so much housing that your rents fell, even some significant fraction of that. And, you'd have vacancies all over town. And one of the things that would happen is developers would stop building. Every time we build more, there's a boom and we have a lot of units come online, it's hard for developers to keep building when they have vacancies. And so there's a natural limit to the extent to which we can solve the housing problem for low income people by just building the high end housing. It's not that it doesn't help. It makes a big difference. It just isn't by itself enough to do the job. So the trade-off that you have to struggle with on council is, we could leave the zoning the way it is, and then we don't get any new housing and we don't get any affordable housing, or we could upzone, and we could upzone either with or without an inclusionary requirement. And what won't surprise you is there's a big difference in terms of the economics of that. So if we upzone without an inclusionary requirement, what that does is it dramatically increases the amount of money that existing landowners can charge when they sell their land to a developer that wants to build housing. And they can capture that money to their families. And that's great for them. And it's great also in the sense that it induces a lot of people to put their land up for sale who might otherwise hold on to it. When we upzone with inclusionary, the idea is that we're reducing the degree to which those land prices rise, and we're using that difference to fund affordable housing for low-income families. So we're splitting some of the benefit between landowners and some of it to low-income residents who are going to live in the city. And when we do it right, it's still an increase in property values, and the property owners are still happy, and we get enough property on the market that we get new development. So that's the goal. And so what we see is that this works mostly in high cost markets, that it's the places where the incentives are worth a lot, where the incentives can actually offset the cost of providing the affordable units. And if the upzoning isn't valuable, then we can't really afford to provide affordable units, and a requirement to do so becomes a barrier to development. So in that sense, inclusionary is like pro-cyclical. Like it wants to work. It only works in markets that are working, that are where development is happening, and where the development economics are desirable and functional on their own. And so then one of the questions that comes up a lot is, well, what happens when there's a downturn in the market like there is right now? So, in the last 8 years, rents have gone up by 22%, but development costs have gone up by 50%. And at the same time, interest rates have driven the returns that investors need to a higher level. So you have this like downturn that makes it hard for anybody to build anything. And this has been the way it's been for a long time, right? There's booms and busts there's a real estate cycle where we build a lot of housing and we get finally a bunch of new units come online, and then rents level out, which is great because it's working to build new units, but rents level out or fall, and that creates this system where then it's harder to start a new project because you can't get the high rents anymore. And so it becomes impractical to start building. And so we get this trough where no one's building, it's too expensive, the costs are too high, and the rents are not high enough to justify them. And so we have several years of no building. And then, well, we haven't built enough to keep up with demand. And so rents start to rise, and that drives new production. And so then we get another cycle of boom. So it's tempting for jurisdictions to want to time the market and to have the inclusionary requirements fluctuate. And just to illustrate the danger of that, San Francisco has had inclusionary for almost 25 years now, and they've adjusted their policy 7 times during that time. And what they've done is they've increased the requirement when the market has been at its peak, and they've decreased it when it's been down at the bottom of the blue bars are like the rate of production in San Francisco. So you can see the red arrow is like they lowered it, and the green arrows they increased it. And from a distance, it sounds like that's a really good idea. Like, let's increase it when it's booming and decrease it when it's not. But what's actually happens is that every time they make a change, it takes a while to go through council and to be debated and discussed and studied, and then to get adopted. And then they need a period of time to notify developers before it takes effect. And so what's happened is when the market is booming and they increase their requirement, that requirement doesn't apply to the units that are built during the boom market that could afford it. That new higher requirement is what applies during the trough. And then when they're at the bottom of the trough and everything is like no one can build, there's political pressure to lower it because the developers say rightly, we can't afford to build the what, do what you can. And the city agrees to lower it, but that lower requirement doesn't apply during the trough. It winds up applying during the peak. And so what San Francisco has done several times now is applied the highest requirements when no one was building anything, and lower requirements might have been helpful, and applied the lowest requirements when it was really easy to build and development was incredibly profitable and they could have afforded more. So they did exactly the opposite of what you would want to do if you were going to time it. And they could have built a lot more affordable housing and had less of a negative impact on the hard difficulty of development during the troughs if they had just kept their policy flat the whole time. So that's sort of the moral of the story is it's tempting to want to adjust, but governments move slowly and it's really hard to guess what's going to happen in the market. And so we don't do a good job of timing the market. So we recommend pick a modest number. Pick a number that you know is less than the peak. You're not going to get the very most you could possibly get at the peak of the market, and live with the fact that also at the trough of the market, nothing's going to be feasible even if your requirement is zero. So just keep it at a modest level and stay steady. The predictability is really valuable, and the moving things around is really causes a lot of chaos and trouble, and it's difficult politically to stand there during a boom market and say, no, we're not going to raise it, or during a trough and say, no, we're not going to lower it. We do think it makes sense to do a study every 5 or so years to look for long-term trends. Not where are we in the cycle, but has it just gotten inherently less profitable to build, or do we have enough land supply, or is there demand in this community? And those trends can influence where you might want to pick as that moderate level. But chasing the up and down is really difficult to do. One thing that some jurisdictions have been doing is temporary incentive programs, which I think is, if you're going to chase the market, is a better way to do it, but also challenging. So as you'll see here, San Francisco in 2023 said, we'll cut the inclusionary requirement in half. They were requiring 22%, which is a lot for the Bay Area. They cut it to 12% for any project that was already permitted but hadn't started construction. And if you started construction within the next 30 months, you could get this lower rate. And the paper said it didn't work because developers didn't take them up on it, because the market's been so bad that even if they had lowered it to zero, they probably wouldn't have gotten a lot built. San Jose, on the other hand, did the same sort of thing more recently, but they said, we'll give a reduction down to 5% for the first 1,800 units that come through. And they limited it to high density buildings. And then they also added a 50% waiver of their building and construction taxes, which amounted to $20 million in fee waivers for the first 1,400 units that came through. So that's $88,000 a unit. So they basically paid the developers to build. The tricky thing is you could say, well, they didn't really pay the developers to build because those were fees they were never going to get because nothing was feasible. So by lowering them, they got something instead of nothing. And that's one way to look at it. And I think it's true. But it's also true that in San Jose, like most of our cities, they only have so many sites where they can build dense housing. And they have an inventory of them and the pipeline of development on them. And they by reducing the inclusionary requirement, they gave up hundreds of affordable units that would have gotten built if they had waited for the market to recover. And they also gave up millions of dollars in fees that they incurred real costs to permit those projects, and they didn't recover some of that cost in those fees. So we don't know what would have happened if they had waited, but it's at least worth thinking about how if they had waited for the market to recover, those same projects might have penciled with the higher fees and the higher affordable housing requirement. And in 50 years from now, they'll have hundreds fewer affordable units in downtown San Jose than they would have if they had waited. We've been sort of stressing the importance of these incentives, and all over the country, I think it's really clear, and that the data supports the idea that having incentives is a critical sort of best practice for inclusionary. But I'm always trying to convince people that they should do it. In Washington State, you have to do it. It's the law. So the state says if you're going to have an inclusionary policy, you have to have incentives. It can be mandatory or it can be voluntary, but it has to be affordable housing in exchange for something. And so you have a nice framework for that. And you don't have a requirement that every dollar that goes to the requirements has to be perfectly offset in every single project. You have a framework that says, let's make sure in general we're providing incentives. And I actually think that's the best practice. And we're spending a lot of time trying to convince other places to do it that way. The things we've been trying to stress are you really can make a big difference with an inclusionary policy. It's not by itself the solution to the housing problem, but it's a reasonable part of a city's strategy. But you do have to acknowledge the trade-offs, and there's been a lot of pushback lately from the point of view of people just wanting to say we should do everything we can to build as much housing as possible. And there's a tendency to try to defend inclusionary as like, oh no, well, we need to do affordable housing instead of market rate housing. But as you saw with Redmond, it's not an either or, it's not an instead. The way we get the most affordable housing is also by getting the most market rate housing. And we need everyone to understand that those two things go together. When we make the market function and want to build, it can afford to provide affordable housing. And when it can't do those things, the answer isn't to require affordable housing, it's to make the place more desirable and make the infrastructure work and all the rest of that stuff. Um, we can get mixed income communities with inclusionary. Um, we don't have to pay for it all with public subsidy. We can't, doesn't mean we don't need public subsidy. And then the results of inclusionary are long-term results. It's not in one year going to be the biggest way you generate housing, but over year after year after year, it adds up to a lot of housing and makes a big difference in how people experience your communities and how diverse they are and where people live and work. So thank you for all your work on all this.